Greetings, friends, and welcome to the podcast of Jewish Ideas, a Torah in Motion podcast. Today, we shall be discussing a fascinating period in world history in general, and in Jewish history in particular. The early modern period, which is often classified as the era between approximately the 1400s to 1700s, was a time of great civilizational upheaval. The scientific revolution, the Christian Reformation, the invention of printing, the dissemination of knowledge, the age of global exploration, the beginning of the Enlightenment, all of these were to permanently leave their mark on human affairs. Today, we would like to take a deep dive into this era and explore what was happening in the world of Jewish affairs and the ways in which Jewish scholars were considering, adapting, and perhaps resisting trends in the early modern period. With us to discuss this today is Dr. Tamara Morsel-Eisenberg, the newly minted Assistant Professor of Jewish History at New York University. She holds a PhD in history from the University of Pennsylvania and is the author of several fascinating articles in her field. I met Dr. Morsel-Eisenberg when she was a member of the Harvard Society of Fellows, one of the most prestigious postdoctoral programs in the country, and where she was researching and lecturing on the evolution of halakhic information within early modern Europe. We are very pleased to have her on the podcast of Jewish Ideas today. Professor Morsel-Eisenberg, welcome.
Thank you.
Excellent. So let's jump right in. First, before we touch on the ideas themselves, I want to clear up one or two technicalities, which goes as follows. And this is something that historians generally hate doing, which is deciding on periodization. So let me frame my question as follows. Okay, if I want to go back, let's say, to the year 1200 and look around, this would be a recognizably medieval world. All the cultural aspects and intellectual aspects in general, for, let's say, the year 1200 or 1100, whatever it is, you look around Europe or the West and say, this is recognizably medieval. If you were to fast forward, let's say, to the year 1800, and we're after the French and American revolutions, and we're after the Enlightenment, etc., one could recognizably, perhaps, again, arguably, look around and say, this is a modern world. This has the hallmarks of the modern era. And then historians come up with this term called the early modern period. And I want to ask you, Professor, what is exactly this period? Do you follow this particular terminology? Would you care to hazard an opinion as to when it begins and ends? And in general, what is the early modern period? What do we mean when we talk about this?
Great. Yes, it is definitely a complicated question. I think in your introduction, you defined it as, starting in the 1400s. I would roughly say maybe the end of the 1400s. That's usually how I think about the early modern period, sort of starting in, somewhere in the 15th century, not clear exactly when, maybe towards the end, right, and ending somewhere, again, in the 18th century, without wanting to put it down too exactly, probably also towards the end. So, as to exactly where you place it, I think your description of it as, there's a recognizably medieval world, there's a recognizably modern world, and the early modern period is somewhere in between is perhaps a more helpful way of thinking about it, right? Rather than trying to place a specific year or very sharp definition on it. In terms of using the term early modern, I mean, there's clearly some teleology involved there, right? You're already assuming that there is a modern period coming after, and the thing that defines the early modern period is the fact that it's before the modern period. But I mean, I'd like to point out then too that Middle Ages or medieval period also has a lot of teleology involved, right? It comes from this Renaissance perspective that, you had the ancient period, which was significant. Then you had the middle period, which are the Middle Ages that sort of didn't matter, right? And then sort of history starts again afterwards, right? So in that sense, you almost cannot avoid, having some sort of teleology as well when you talk about early modern, right? Some sort of definition that assumes that, there's a directionality to history, that there are certain periods that are perhaps more significant than others, right? And that sort of folds that directionality into the definition of the period itself. So in that sense, I mean, do I use it? I think the again, rough definitions of the period as being, not quite the Middle Ages, but not the early modern period, not the modern period, are a helpful way of thinking about it. And there are definitely characteristics that we can talk about that are typical of this period. In terms of how helpful it is, right? Or, whether it's a problematic term to use or you want to use it, it's definitely problematic in the sense that it's not precise, and in the sense that it has, it assumes certain things about how to define a period and what's significant and what isn't. But as much as that's problematic, I think it's also very important, because in discussing whether this is a good way to define a certain period or not, we're also engaging very much in ideas about what matters about history and how do we want to define a period, right? And what defines a change in period? What are we even looking for in history? I would say specifically for Jewish history, right? What do we find important about Jewish history? What story are we trying to tell? Right? And precisely the things that make it so problematic mean that arguing about whether something's a good definition or not is exactly where it's at in many ways, and actually reveals very important things about history in general and Jewish history in particular. So, while I recognize that there are issues with any periodization you would want to engage in, I also think that the goal should not be to come up with the perfect periodization, nor should it be to do away with it altogether. I think that discussing it is, where the interesting things happen.
Excellent. Well, discuss it we shall. And you mentioned certain characteristics, and this is obviously a podcast of ideas interested in intellectual history. So before we move on to specifically the Jewish element, which we're obviously going to get to, perhaps you can give us for a couple of minutes the general, let's say, intellectual, ideational characteristics of the early modern period. What was going on during these centuries which made it different from the medieval period?
Sure. So a small caveat I think it's worth starting off with is that in many ways the term early modern was used maybe to replace or to broaden the idea of the Renaissance.
Okay.
Right. So I think the Renaissance, we have very specific characteristics we associate. It's more of a maybe cultural and intellectual movement than other types of periodization, right? We associated maybe with Italy, maybe with, Europe and humanism, right? With certain kinds of art and writing. You're thinking, I don't know, Da Vinci, right? It takes you to a certain sort of cultural and intellectual place. The caveat involved here is that this is a very Eurocentric definition, and it's again a very sort of intellectual definition, and perhaps involves very specific layers of the population and not everyone. And then this takes you to that world of critiques you can have of almost any periodization. I'd say maybe almost any definition of anything, right? That it doesn't take everything into consideration. Right? So the characteristics historians have tried to come up with that are a little bit broader will also be a little bit more general and fuzzy for the same reason. Right? But if you want to go beyond just this cultural intellectual world, you can think of, economic and social definitions. Right. So some historians will talk about the early modern period as a shift away from the more local subsistence economies to longer distance trade, to a surplus economy related to changes in demographics and agriculture that cause these things. And of course, also developments in seafaring and navigation technology and other elements that created a new world when it came to trade. Right, and the different products being traded, and so on. So that's sort of one aspect. If you want to look at it more in terms of ideas and religion, the early modern period is obviously the period of the wars of religion, right? The Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, and everything that came after. In terms of, ideas beyond religion, maybe we can talk about the scientific revolution as sort of an important change that happens in this period. Right, in terms of technology and discoveries, or we can talk about print, we can talk about developments in navigation and technology, the discovery of the New World, obviously, right? So these kind of other things that develop in terms of politics, you can look at the beginning of centralized states being formed. So absolutism in terms of sort of the kind of rule you're getting, a move out of the feudal world into a world of more unified states, doing away with that in between layer, right, of these feudal, smaller feudal, not right realms ruled by nobility, and really getting this idea of there being one central ruler on top of it. And with this unification and this centralization of rule come other phenomena, right? Like that are developed in the realms of like the military, for example, but also in the realms of bureaucracy and increasing bureaucracy and collecting of data, which is important for historians also because this is data that we then have and can study.
Right. Most useful to have something to actually look at. Yes.
Exactly. So this is another sort of aspect that we associate with the early modern period politically, this idea of a more central rule slowly emerging.
Excellent. So of the many elements you touched on there, it's fascinating. It's as we see the early modern shift, as it were, encompassed many different aspects of human life. So let's talk a little bit about the scientific revolution, as you mentioned it. So the scientific revolution is usually seen as something that took place, shall we say, the 1600s and 1700s, maybe even slightly earlier, and included dramatic and very important progress in fields such as mathematics and physics and astronomy and biology and medicine, both in terms of discoveries that were made during that period, figures such as Isaac Newton or Leibniz or Galileo and others, and also both in terms of discoveries, but also in terms of methodology, in terms of what scientists were looking for, what scholars were looking for, and the manner in which they tried to go about getting things. So this is where I want to sort of maybe start touching on the Jewish aspect of this as well, because this is a revolution going on among select intellectuals in Europe. And the question is, to what extent does this bleed into or affect the Jewish world? So you have Jews who are part of this intellectual social world, and you have a scientific revolution going on, let's say, in the 1600s. So is this something that Jews get caught up in? Do they participate in it? Is this reflected in Jewish scholarship?
You certainly have discussions here and there of rabbis talking about these changes, right? And several historians have sort of studied these, right? One of the, I think, remarkable examples is Rabbi David Nieto, who was a rabbi in London in the Newtonian period, and was giving these lectures about how sort of scientific ideas are reflected, right, and how sort of what a Jewish take would be on these scientific ideas. In terms of, which side of this rabbis take, they're not always, let's say, on the most up-to-date part of the, that they won't always pick the side that turns out to be the one, let's say, that wins the day. But they're clearly exposed to the discussions that are going on at the time, right? And there, I think it's important not from our end, not to project onto that period and assume that because we know how these debates ended, that at the time this was so clear, right? So these are ideas that are swirling around and being debated and discussed at the time. If you want to, take it one step further away, maybe from, rabbis who are actually exposed and reading these materials, right? And we can think of David Nieto as one example, right? We can think of the circle around the Maharal of Prague, as well as a, circle where you have rabbis who are aware of what is going on in terms of scientific discovery at the time. And again, exposed to it and thinking about these issues. You can think of different ways in which this is perhaps expressing itself, for example, in the medical school in Padua, right? In Padua in northern Italy, this was the first time that there was a medical school that would admit Jewish students as Jewish students. And they had their own, all the students there were organized according to their nationalities. And these, they weren't really fraternities, but these kind of, groups that would give them both in terms of material and practical support, right? Places to eat, and so on, but also, friendship and camaraderie. And the Jews had their own such organization as well, right? And they even help them at the spiritual level to prepare for these studies, right? Both to prepare in terms of learning the languages that were needed, but also in terms of thinking about these things. So you also have it almost as a broader phenomenon with Jews from all over coming and going to study in Padua and it, imbibing this kind of medical education at the time.
Fascinating. So you're saying when the history of Jewish frat houses in universities will be written, the 16th century Padua will be the starting point. for this.
Perhaps, or the history of, I mean, the history of Jewish doctors definitely starts before then, but as
Right.
a broader phenomenon to some extent, this is, a very important chapter in the history of Jewish doctors.
Fascinating. And you're saying, so this is an example of an institution being broad-minded and open-minded intellectually enough to allow in Jews, and to allow Jews, therefore, to get the sort of medical training that would be recognized in broader society as such.
Right, and this is also reflected in some of the rabbinic responsa, so answers to, halakhic questions that you get in this period. Some of which are about whether it's permitted to, attend a dissection. It's reflected in rabbinic responsa that they're asking questions. Are there questions about certain types of, healing, whether it's done with non-kosher products, whether that should be allowed or not, right? So you have questions that come up in rabbinic responsa that reflect exposure to scientific knowledge, and some of it definitely coming through these medical academies.
I see. This is also touches on something that I want to bring up, because this is very interesting. That this is also the time, I mean, from the 1500s, where you see a precipitous decline in Jewish philosophy. So the discipline of medieval Jewish philosophy had really, you can chart it quite sharply within intellectual history. So it started basically with Saadia Gaon in 10th century Baghdad, and ended, difficult to say exactly, but probably the last great figure was Yitzhak Abarbanel, who died in 1512 or 1515 in Italy, I believe. And from then on, you don't have anything like what was recognizably medieval Jewish philosophy. So are these trends coming, difficult to say, to replace it, or are they the new way that broad-minded Jewish intellectuals try and exercise that faculty? Or are these two entirely different phenomena that I'm artificially putting together?
Interesting. I don't know how much I thought of the two in terms of one another. What I do think, as to your question about Jewish philosophy in general, I mean, I think it depends on where what you look for when you look for philosophy. Definitely of the medieval kind, it will be harder to find, but I think it's important to think in general what happens in this period with medieval philosophy, with scholasticism, right? These are not necessarily the trending, modes of thinking at the time.
On the contrary. Yeah.
And what you get, right, but not just in the Jewish world, is what I'm trying to say, right? What you get a lot of this more syncretistic thinking. There's a lot of hermeticism, a lot of sort of these big schemes that somehow, I mean, we'd identify them as mysticism in a way, but that connect many different corpora of knowledge. And that you do get in many ways in Jewish thought as well at the time. And I'm not just thinking about the more famous ones, such as, I mean, I'd even see in a way the Maharal of Prague as the sort of thinker that, you don't think of it as a philosophy comparable to kind of, medieval Jewish philosophers. But there is definitely this sort of larger form of thinking that tries to combine many corpora of knowledge together. But even places where maybe we're not used to thinking, for example, Rabbi Moshe Isserles, one of the most important halachists of the early modern period, usually known as the Ramah, wrote this work called Torah To'ala, which is also kind of this syncretistic combining of what you can think of as sort of philosophy with mystical thought, right? Looking at, human history and the body and the Beit HaMikdash as these sort of parallel structures and putting them together, right? And in that sense, I see a lot of Jewish thought. And also, if you're willing to broaden your, definition of what, of what Jewish philosophy is, this is the era of sort of the boom of Kabbalah. And I think that could definitely be seen as a Jewish philosophy, right? Or a way of going about thinking about, the world and the place of man in the world, and sort of this transcendent realm, in maybe with a vocabulary that we don't always identify as philosophical, but in a mode that definitely is a kind of philosophy.
So firstly, I mean, you touched upon a point that is a point of debate, both among Kabbalists and among academic scholars of Kabbalah, which is the extent to which Kabbalah is in fact philosophy, or should be seen as a sort of a series of answers, or a network or a framework that attempts to answer the same questions that philosophers try to answer as well. I want to touch on Kabbalah a little bit later, With your permission, I want to draw our attention to something which is also a huge technological advance during the early modern period, which is, of course, the invention of printing. Now, printing was a technology that had already existed to a certain degree in the Far East, in China, a little bit in the Arabic world as well. But this is something that comes into Europe in the 16th century, and really proves to be a technology that entirely upends or entirely changes the whole scene of knowledge and dissemination of knowledge. So could you perhaps take us through this, both the effect of printing itself and also within the Jewish world? What does printing do to the spread of Jewish ideas?
Right. So, I mean, we don't know exactly when, printing of the type that we're talking about started. Usually see it somewhere in the 15th century. Mm-hmm. What we talk about when we talk about print in this sense, and as you said, in different cultures, forms of printing, one way or another, already existed. What we talk about is movable type. Right? So a movable type means is that, right, it's actually very simple difference that makes a huge difference in the in the bigger picture, right? But we're talking about the fact that you can use individual letters to create words, and then you can take them apart again and use them to form other words, right? And you're using them kind of as, right, the stamp that you're printing, you're printing your page with, right? So not to get too technical, but right, you could take them apart. You set up the layout of a page by putting these letters kind of in a frame. You use those, and then you can take them apart and create another page, right? So
and you could stamp the same page hundreds of times and produce.
Yes.
Right.
So the repetition aspect of it already existed in different cultures, where they could sort of engrave an entire page, right? You can just repeat that. But the fact that you could take the letters apart and then create a new one is really what what caused this to become a disruptive technology, in a sense.
Right.
But because then you could just, with a limited set of letters, create books, right? And right, in those terms, it just reproduced and made knowledge. It made it possible to disseminate knowledge in unprecedented ways. And that is really kind of the technological change that really mattered here, right? So it was both the fact that you could repeat it, but also the fact that, right, a relatively small amount of material could get you there, in a sense. So in terms of, the change it made in general, in, at least the parts of the world that were using print, because not in every culture was it completely accepted and did it penetrate to the same degree. But I think there you can really trace that for the Jewish world, and I'd say sort of, Europe in general, anyone using sort of the Latin alphabet, and for the world of Hebrew printing, the developments are more or less parallel. Right? So in terms of how fast the networks developed, right? I mean, obviously proportional to the audience and the readership, but it's happening basically at the same time, more or less. And the changes you see, I mean, some of them are more quantitative and some of them are more qualitative. And it's important to distinguish, because there has been a debate about sort of how influential was, print altogether, right? And the assumptions were, most famously advanced by Elizabeth Eisenstein, that the printing press, is at the basis of everything from, the Reformation to the Scientific Revolution, sort of everything that happens at the period, because you had these suddenly fixed text that people could discuss. You could refer to the same page. You have all these qualities of sort of stability and fixity and this unprecedented dissemination that really, made things possible that weren't possible before. A big part of what made these kind of discussions possible, and so Eisenstein argued made, in a sense, caused the scientific revolution and the Reformation. Right? And when someone like Luther had questions about Catholicism, suddenly, he could disseminate them in this way that was just impossible to think about before. Right? So these are important points, but as those who sort of countered or wanted to qualify her view have pointed out, this is not a question of technology alone. Right. And the way they sort of, wrap this, and I think it's relevant nowadays when we're thinking a lot about changes in technology and how it affects knowledge, right, is they call this a form of technological determinism. right? To
Right.
say that sort of a new technology arrives and boom, like everything, everything changes. There are different critiques of this point of view. One of them is maybe to your points before about this sort of fixity and the fact that, scribal copying brings in all these errors versus printing. There's a lot of this kind of exercise of pointing out, no, actually, the world of manuscripts was not that different. Right? And they'll either point out that, for example, the way in which manuscripts were copied in general in, Europe, Latin manuscripts at least were in what were called scriptoria. So these almost like small factories, right, where you have many monks copying the same text at the same time, and that this is not very different from how you'd imagine kind of the print shop, right? Remarkably, this is different in the Jewish world because we don't really have that phenomenon. Right? Usually scribes copy text either for themselves or for one person who requests it. And that's what research has found. So in that sense, our manuscript world is maybe more different from the world of print than you could talk about in the Christian world. Right? But that's one kind of way of saying, they manage just fine with manuscripts. Right? A good sort of Jewish example for this is when you say, well, now they could refer, to one of maybe the most famous products of the print revolution, right? The Bomberg Talmud.
Yes.
That also gave us, in a sense, right? It's definitely the first full Talmud that has all the tractates printed, and right has all the tractates with the Tzuras Hadaf, right, with the layout of the page and the pagination as we know it today, and that makes it possible for scholars from all over to discuss. And they're talking about exactly the same page. Well, when you look at the manuscript era, they manage just fine by just citing the chapter, right? They talk about it's in the beginning of Perek so and so, right, and everyone knew what you're talking about. Right, so this is one of these ways of saying, it's not that big a revolution. The world before and the world after didn't look that different. Right, there's a lot of emphasis by scholars on what you said, right, that with scribes you have more mistakes creeping in, saying, well, with print you often have mistakes, right, and there's slew of examples in the world of, for example, Adrian Johns did this for printing in Britain, just of how many mistakes enter in printed editions, even from one copy to the next sometimes, right? But there's a lot of mistakes. And if perhaps you have one type of mistakes that come up less, right? These sort of individual mistakes for every copy, right? Because you're repeating it. If you do have a mistake, it gets spread and copied so much faster and further and becomes sort of impossible to take back. Right. So in that sense, right, it depends what you're comparing and in what you have more mistakes, right? So these are all ways of talking about how, this is maybe not as, big a change as it used to be. I think those can be defined as, kind of just introducing, right, qualifying it, introducing these sort of, food for thought type of ways of saying, maybe it's not as different as you wanted. As you wanted to think about before. I think the important part of discussing technological determinism is maybe not those sort of smaller corrections, but it's really talking about how technology alone does not do anything, right? Okay. Technology alone is part of a world, right, where you have culture that plays a role. Right? By culture, I mean sort of institutions where these things are taught, habits that people have, practices that scholars use, that they're kind of used to, and which is the way in which they, transmit knowledge, right? So all of these other aspects, right? I'm not even talking about sort of the economics of these issues and, right, the cultural aspects and religious aspects, like those are all part of this world of transmitting knowledge, of which technology is just one piece.
So it's obviously very frustrating because, of course, you're doing what all good historians like to do, which is to gravely complicate a nice, neat narrative that we've all heard before. And of course, that's both aggravating and necessary. And I actually agree with you that, the Bomberg printing press was crucial in all sorts of ways. And I think the book has really yet to be written on just how important just his particular, or that particular printing press, the contribution was, whether from the production of the Talmud or the Second Rabbinic Bible, or even just the square letters, the Hebrew sort of very square kind of letters that we're used to seeing today. I mean, it's extraordinary. So I'm going to actually throw another nice, neat narrative about printing at you and see if you similarly upend or complicate this, which goes as follows, which is that it's often said that printing was a great democratization of knowledge. Because suddenly, with so many copies of the same book, and books just becoming so much cheaper and so much easier and so much more readily available, that suddenly many more people were reading these texts, many more people could be discussing these texts, and basically knowledge ceased to be a preserve of just the very few who could afford manuscripts or could somehow get their hands on a manuscript, and suddenly became the preserve of the many. Now, this does sound like a very nice and easily digestible narrative. Certainly within the Jewish world, is there some truth to this?
I mean, we definitely see certain genres that you would not have seen before, right? So we're thinking about genres that you can really identify as popular, such as Yiddish writing and printing in Yiddish that you would not have seen before. Even some halakhic works prepared in Yiddish for a more popular reader. So, you do definitely see a lot of these books exist that you just wouldn't have seen before to the same extent. Right. So in that sense, you definitely have some sort of popularization, right? Before you talk about democratization, I think you have to take into consideration all these prerequisites, right? Before you can even,
such as,
right, think of such as literacy, right? Being able to read and write. We still don't have exactly the final word on, how literate were Jews, who was literate, what did it take, right? There's general understanding usually that Jews were more literate than their surroundings, but we still don't know exactly, how to quantify this, how it applies to, men versus women and so on, right? So that's one issue. But even the concept of sort of what does literacy mean, we've understood as much too simplistic than I think, we should think about it, right? So there are different forms of literacy, right? You can think of, it's not a binary, like someone literate or not, right? You can think of people who are literate enough to understand things with some context, right? You have people who maybe wouldn't buy your own books, but they're exposed to texts as, like broadsides published and hung up on the street, right? So you have all these different contexts of literature and literacy that we maybe need to sort of expand if we want to think of what it means to popularize knowledge. That said, and I'm going back also to the previous sort of big narrative surrounding print and technology that you presented. I don't think these things disprove, right, the absolute importance of these changes and the sort of big things that happen. It just wants to make them less simplistic. So I think there definitely is a big difference. I think, right, in that sense, if I talked about quantitative versus qualitative, there are qualitative differences between manuscript and print, right? It's not just that you can reproduce text faster and with, less mistakes and cheaper and so on, right? There are actual differences in terms of how the economics of print work as opposed to the economics of creating a manuscript, right? Some of which make it harder to reproduce a printed text than a manuscript text, but some of which make it much, much easier. The people involved, right? Suddenly you have this whole team of people, and some of them are doing like very physical work. They just sort of, dragging heavy machinery, basically, right? So you have this whole, right, whose hands is this reproducing of text suddenly in, right? And you go from it being one scribe to it being several people. Questions such as sort of when is something published and how do you publish it? These things are not just, in terms of numbers growing faster or larger or more, right? They're happening differently completely, right? And those changes cannot but be significant.
Right. Okay, I'd like to maybe focus to sharpen this on one particular individual who you recently published an article on, an excellent article, if I may say so, on my great ancestor, Rabbi Yaakov Emden, who was an 18th century rabbi living in Germany. And what is fascinating to me about his life, I mean, he was very productive and very, he wrote an awful lot, and he was both admired and reviled, depending on which circles you were in. But what's fascinating about him is that he essentially, if I'm not mistaken, essentially owned his own printing press. He was able to write and then produce books and then send them out. Was this key to his quote unquote success? I mean, to his fame or his being taken seriously?
I mean, I wouldn't call it key to success just in the sense that he was a prolific thinker and writer and rabbi and scholar. He was his father was the Chacham Tzvi, right? He was part. He would have been a big and important rabbi, probably with or without. I wouldn't want to reduce Rav Yaakov Emden to sort of the fact that he had this printing press and he was also a printer. Right. With that said, I think it's a key to understanding particular aspects of Rav Yaakov Emden's work. Right. So definitely his occupation as what is sometimes called a heresy hunter. Right. And we didn't go back to discuss kind of the Jewish version of the early modern period, right? And what are sort of, we talked about general characteristics in, for the early modern period in, Europe and beyond. We didn't talk so much about sort of the Jewish ones, but heresy and Sabbatianism are, a big part of it. And Emden's job as a heresy hunter and as someone who tries to discover and root out Sabbatianism wherever he sees it, I think their print is crucial in understanding how he goes about it and his kind of philosophy of this. And this is an article I have not published. It's, a paper I wrote at some point and didn't do much with.
Yet.
Thank you. But it discusses really some of his anti-Sabbatian pamphlets, which he printed. So a lot of his output from his own printing press were these kind of pamphlets sometimes against most famously Rabbi Yonasan Abrashitz, but against, all different phenomena that he relates to this. And what I try to show in that paper is that he really believed that the printing press and sort of dragging this out to the public would be what would solve the issue. He thought that the big problem in his period especially was that these heresies had kind of like plausible deniability, often because they were cloaked in a lot of Kabbalah. So you can kind of deny or say you're really dealing with aspects of esoteric teachings and not necessarily heresy. Right, and it sort of allows you to hide things there. And he thought if he would explicate it and sort of make it public and known that, this big rabbi who maybe, pretends to be completely orthodox and, non-heretical rabbi is actually hiding heresies, if he could just explain it and lay it out and sort of drag it into the light, then everyone would recognize it and they would, be able to sort of separate who is heretical from who is, the kind of Jew that he, wanted to, the kind of Judaism that he wanted to promote. And in many ways, I think it's also part of what's tragic about Rav Yaakov Emden's story of why, in a sense, his cries were not heard. This was his hope of what, publicizing this, and printing there, I think, is part of publicizing it. But it's saying, like, if I could only show you, right, how heretical these rabbis are and all these things that to you might seem innocent are really heresies, then you would all believe me. And, we'd be able to separate these problematic figures from sort of mainstream acceptable Judaism. I think his evaluation of sort of whether rabbis wanted this at all, and whether this approach works, was not correct in the sense that this was not what resonated with people and it didn't work. And printing pamphlets that said, the example that I used in that paper was these amulets of Rabbi Yonasan Aibeshitz that he explicated, right, which is just a very sort of printer-y kind of approach to amulets. I mean, you're not supposed to, right? Amulets are objects. No. They're not, you're not supposed to open them up and analyze the text.
Exactly. They're also intensely personal. They're usually written for a person, for a specific, ailment or problem, or it's very, yes, as you say, very personal and private thing.
They're personal. I don't know if copies of them would work, right? That's not the point.
Oh,
they're
true.
Right? They're sanctified in a sense as they're supposed to do the thing they do as individual objects. Many of them are folded and closed up, and like even so, you're not supposed to open them even, let alone sit there and sort of analyze them as though there's some sort of public text. And that's precisely what he does, right? He opens them, he reproduces them, and he writes a whole analysis of why these are clearly heretical ideas, right? And he sort of deciphers them using all kinds of systems, right, like Bash and other ideas, and shows like how this is clearly heretical. And now that you can all see this, I think he was expecting, for Rabbi Yonasan Abishitz to be at the very least, canceled and fired by the next day once everyone sees this. And of course, that's not at all what happens, right? And
Doesn't
in
quite
a
work out,
sense,
yeah.
it's kind of a right, like this was what he thought is the antidote to the problem. And as some historians have shown, many of the sort of establishment rabbis were not at all keen on rooting out heretics if they weren't openly breaking Jewish law or openly associating with Christianity or Islam, depending on the kind of heresy we're talking about. They'd rather not, create any issues.
What's just fascinating to me is that without the technology of printing, that kind of solution to this problem would have been unavailable. In other words, that what Rav Yaakov England tries to do in his heresy hunting fever and reproduce these texts and essentially show, not tell, but show everyone the difficulties there. That couldn't have been the case unless you could very quickly and very easily mass produce texts for essentially mass consumption, or at least mass consumption among those who are literate.
Right. So in many ways, this was kind of a pamphlet war happening, but it was in a sense one-sided. Right. So Emden was the one sort of creating the pamphlets, and I mean he has interesting discussions of in his Megillat Sefer, which is kind of an autobiographical type of document or his own, life's history. He discusses raids that some of the competing rabbis and the community conducted on his printing press and his printed materials in an attempt to find these pamphlets, right? Mm-hmm. So definitely his side of this battle is waged by printing and pamphlets, and some of the opposition to it comes to attack his printing press and his pamphlets. But the other side, or in this case, Rabbi Yonasan Abishitz, prints almost nothing regarding any of this, right? So his kind of resistance in a way is not printing.
It's interesting because it reminds me a little bit nowadays there's of the blogosphere, essentially, that the ideological wars taking place. Maybe, I mean, social media again to an extent, but I think there's a better analogy to blogs, at least which used to be popular 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago in all sorts of heresy hunting examples. For example, the Rabbi Natan Slifkin, when he was banned by certain rabbis, and he responds with his own blog, and there's this war of words, but generally one side is more adept at using and disseminating, certainly on the internet, their words, essentially defending themselves, whereas the other side doesn't use this medium very much at all, and therefore everything, at least online, is more or less lopsided. Okay.
Yeah, I mean it's a good defense in a way, right? Because you don't feed the other side either, right? In that sense. But I mean, I think a big similarity that you get with sort of big debates going on, I guess, today, or, you can't even call them debates online, right, is this idea that you think you'll just bring, right, the evidence, the receipts, the I don't know what, and then people will be convinced. And like, that's just usually not where it's at. Right. There are very few converts from one side to another based on those kind of things.
Interesting. I would like to shift into an area of your personal expertise, namely that of halakha during this time, because the early modern period, this is a period in which you've done some work on halakhic developments, both form and content, let's say during the, 16th, 17th century, something like that, and what's going on there. So let's jump into it. I mean, most famously, the halakhic works produced during that period are the Shulchan Aruch, by Rabbi Yosef Karo. This is in 16th century Tzfat, which is a sort of a very austere and sparse halakhic code. And most famously, the person who we mentioned before, the Ramah of Moshe Isserles, he, living in Krakow, he responds by writing, I would say, glosses or something along the line. So those are the most important and central developments in halakha during that period. So what was going on during this period? What was new? What was innovative about this? And why did it come to pass during this period?
So, I mean, I guess I'll answer both of those together in a sense, right? So what was innovative and why then? Partially, what we mentioned print already as one of the reasons, right? I'd say one of the biggest developments indeed in the world of halakha in the period is the creation of the Shulchan Aruch, together with Rabbi Moshe Silas's or the Ramah's glosses, right, which he titled the Mapah. He would tell you that he didn't, develop them as a reaction or response, right? Because the work that preceded Shulchan Aruch was Rabbi Yosef Karo's Beit Yosef, which itself are glosses or, larger commentary and updating of the 14th century al-Baturim, right? Rabbi Yaakov ben Asher's Code of Jewish Law, right? Which summarizes and organizes Jewish law for the 14th century, and Rabbi Yosef Karo went ahead and sort of, updated that, added commentary, discussion, weighed the different sides, and then, tries to arrive at some sort of discussion. And then, the Shulchan Aruch being the sort of bottom line of that, right? And taking sort of either the legal conclusions of Bet Yosef, or just taking that same pattern and structure and, coming to much sparser and, as you said, austere sort of summaries. And Rabbi Moshe Silas describes having worked on a very, very similar project and only, part of the way through, hearing that Rabbi Yosef Karo was already much more, well-known and more senior at the time, had already began doing the same thing. And I think that in itself is part of the world of print. Many, many rabbis, the way in which they studied and taught halakha was using the al-Baturim as a sort of rough structural reference. And everyone who was, both studying and teaching these things would write glosses in the margins as they went along, and sort of using that as, the logic of the way in which they study and teach. Right. And then students would copy your glosses, or, colleagues would look at your glosses or learn from you and copy. This very encounter of saying, oh, we're both doing the same thing, and now that he did it already, there's no point in me also publishing it, and I will just publish mine as an addition to his work, is already, in a sense, a product of print, in that, like, it makes no sense to duplicate this, and it already exists, and everyone can just buy one of these. So, why create two, and let's just combine them, right? So that in itself, in a way, would not have happened before. The other thing that happens, and we're slowly assembling, I think, what the characteristics are of the early modern period for Jewish history. Yes. We talk about heresy as one of them. Print plays a role. I mean, I wrap it in sort of a bigger characteristic. David Ruderman, in his book on early modern Jewry, called it knowledge explosion, right? So of which print is sort of one aspect. But another important part of the early modern period is mobility. Now, Jews have never really stayed put for long, to a large part because they weren't allowed, and nobody would sort of let them put down roots and stay in one place, right? So Jews have always been moving around, but in the early modern period, it really goes up a notch. And I think the best way to characterize it is to say that both the two main sort of Jewish subcultures, the Sephardi and the Ashkenazi worlds, in the early modern period, are both no longer in their original locations, right? So the Sephardi world is no longer in Iberia. They have been expelled at the end of the 15th century. And the Ashkenazi world is no longer in Western Europe. So you find them now in places like Poland, Lithuania, and so on. But there is definitely a point there, around somewhere in the 16th century, and it reverses. It's harder to say for Europe because we're talking about much, much smaller sort of states and principalities and duchies and so on, but where there are no Jews west of Poland, right? And I mean, Italy's a bit of an exception there, but, France, Germany, right? These kind of areas.
These are tiny communities,
Yeah, and they're, gradually being expelled and pushed out. Again, the timelines don't line up nicely. You can't talk about sort of one date like with Spain and Portugal, because we're talking about these smaller, really smaller communities and groups. So it's more piecemeal and gradual, and then some of them are allowed back, right? But largely you have this moving of Ashkenaz away from what Ashkenaz is identified with. And yet both communities keep calling themselves both Ashkenazim and Sfaradim, right? For like until this day.
Yes.
Right. So you have this sense of different Jewish communities moving and also taking their ways of their customs and their ways of fulfilling halakha elsewhere, and also the encounter of these groups with each other, right? So in places like Italy, in places like in the Ottoman Empire, but also in port cities like Hamburg, for example, right, and Amsterdam, right, I mentioned Italy, Venice, and so on, you get these encounters of Jews from different places doing halakha in some ways similarly and in some ways differently. And this is, to a large extent, also what brings about this shift in the halakhic world, right? And what brings about this idea of the Shulchan Aruch.
So are you essentially making the argument that because of this mobility and, I would say, let's say, clash of Jewish civilizations that you find in these new areas the Jews are moving to, there was a necessity for a uniform standard set of practices, let's say, and therefore these codes are written as a response. Is that essentially what you're saying?
I mean, I wouldn't place the sort of cause and effect there quite the way you phrased it, just because so partially, right, what you get is print making it possible to create this big work that will, summarize all of Jewish law. And as I said, right, this is based on the Al Batulim, which, right, existed before, right? So there is such a model that exists, but here you get it in even sparser, more austere form, right? And what happened in between, sort of what happened between the 14th century when the Al Batulim was written and the Shulchan Aruch, right, is also print, which created many, many more halakhic works being written and being made, in a sense, permanent and having to be incorporated into this. So you need an update, for like reasons of time, right? What happens though when you get the Sephardi Shulchan Aruch is that it's printed now, and you want to be able to use it in Ashkenaz. And of course, there you have different ways of doing things. So there is, on the one hand, there is this desire to sort of want to unify the law, not just because a lot of time has passed and a lot of new works have been written in the meantime, but also in terms of space, right? That geographies have shifted, and people need to know what they can do, right, in their community. And right, I think it's not a coincidence that both the Al Batulim and the Shulchan Aruch were written by rabbis who moved, right, from one place to another, right? The Rosh, who's sort of the main inspiration, the father of Rav Yaakov Baal HaTurim, right, Rav Asher ben Yechiel the Rosh, was sort of one of the main connectors between Sfarad and Ashkenaz in his age. And in the case of Rav Yosef Karo, also you have a figure who leaves Iberia, gets to Tzfat, but so you have that kind of encounter, and then you have the encounter with the Ashkenazi world, and Rav Moshe Sodus says, this is most of the way applicable to everyone, but there are differences with Ashkenaz, and that's the differences that he inserts. And what you get as a result then is a code that almost any Jew anywhere can use.
Interesting. So you mentioned the halakhic works that have been written in the interim, the couple of centuries since print until then. Am I correct in saying that these weren't codes mostly? These were either responsa material or halakhic treaties dealing with a specific area, correct?
Yes, mostly. So, I mean, we're talking about also works that were written before print, right? But that before print may be, they were specific to particular locations, particular cultures, right? They were used in specific ways, and again, and there I go into this, right, saying of technology alone not being sufficient, and having to think about how technology is part of scholarly traditions and practices and culture, right? This was, right, you had certain texts that existed, but they were used in certain ways, and rabbis knew how and where, and it was sort of localized, and there were these traditions of how to deal with it, right? What you get with print is that now they're sort of, you don't know who the audience is and what they're reading and how they're reading it, and right, and it has to be accounted for in a different way.
That's very interesting, and I suppose in the sense that print makes the author lose control of the text to a certain degree, because who knows where it will go? Who knows in whose hands it'll end up in? That's very. I want to get back to that in a moment, but I just want to pose the following question, which is that so then we see, with the writing of the great halakhic codes, the Shulchan Aruch and the Mapa, you see, I suppose, a shift to a certain degree from in form, right? So it goes from responsa to code, and the question becomes, okay, does that parallel is that entail a shift in content as well? So or what is the effect? What do you see in terms of the content of halakha when it goes from responsa, which is question, answer, and they're very lengthy and detailed and convoluted in general. That's the sheilot utshuvot or shutim. And then you go into code, which is just do this, don't do that, do this, don't do that, with relatively little detail attached to that. So you have a shift in form. Is there also a shift in content?
Yes, so definitely, that kind of shift in form or a shift in genre and mode of writing definitely takes along with it changes in content, maybe not necessarily in the legal bottom line, although even there you get such things, and I can think of a couple of examples where this definitely happens, right? But even right the context and the way in which the form works will influence, right, the way in which the law is presented and the kind of things you can easily do with it, as opposed to the things you really need to defend very hard and bring a lot of justifications for, right? So even if you sometimes might get to the same result, it's a very different mode of presentation. It's a very different mode of thinking legally and a very different mode of working with law.
Could you perhaps give an example of something like that?
So to give specific examples, and I don't want to go too much into sort of the details and get into the weeds here, right? But when you look at laws of kosher meat, as they're described in sort of a typically Ashkenazi work, the work Sharei Dura, which was written by Rabbi Yitzchak of Durin, probably in the 13th century, and describes the different steps for sort of salting and soaking and making meat kosher after slaughter. And you have their different, differences of opinion, which extend even into the 16th century. So you have Ramah and his slightly more senior relative and colleague, Rabbi Shlomo Luria or Maharshal, who have different opinions on, a certain sub-case of what to do with soaking this meat. And when you look at the discussion and the difference of opinion in the context of Sharei Dura and the way the laws are presented and set up there, Ramah has to defend his opinion to be lenient very, very strongly. And Maharshal, takes it apart and really attacks him for doing this. And no matter what you think of the actual discussion there and who has sort of a better case, when you look at it in Shulchan Aruch, and Ramah sort of takes the entire Sharei Dura, the sort of preparatory work he did before Shulchan Aruch, specifically for these laws, was called Torat Chatat. And that is Ramah's sort of taking these laws of Sharei Dura and streamlining them and organizing them and summarizing them. And then he places them eventually in Shulchan Aruch. Right? So all he basically needs to do is take what he did in Torat Chatat and reshuffle the order and put it in the correct places in Shulchan Aruch. But when he's doing that, when you're looking at what Ramah does there, he's suddenly in a very different context, right? He's in a context where the majority law goes according to the Sephardi sources, because that's how Rabbi Yosef Karo set it up, right? Where the order and the way in which the sections follow one another is the order of the Shulchan Aruch, which is the order of the Al Baturim and not the order of Sharei Dura. And there, Ramah's interpretations seem almost obvious. Right. So if, for example, in the Sephardi context regarding some of these laws, the overwhelming opinion was to be more lenient with certain ideas. So Rav Moshe Isserlis, in the Ashkenazi context, it might seem outrageous that he's being so lenient. When you take that and plop it down in a context where everyone else is being lenient, suddenly it's like, doesn't seem so crazy anymore. Right. Or another aspect of form, when you summarize law, right, and you streamline it, you sort of take away the sort of the caveats and the disagreements with the other sides, right? You talked about responsa as one example, right, where you really have, right, what you call convoluted. A lot of what's convoluted about responsa is that they sort of go back and forth. Right? They say, well, and you're going to say this, and I'm going to say this against it, and this is not exactly quite like the other thing. But so when you're doing that, some aspects of legal reasoning are very, very strong, right? Your intellectual virtuosity sometimes shines much, much more. But when you're already giving the sort of summary in the bottom line, you can make your conclusion seem much more straightforward. than it does when you're engaged in sort of disagreeing and battling and defending yourself, right? You already sort of remove all the things that seem problematic when you're summarizing, right? So in that sense, genre and organization as well make things so different.
You don't have to show you're working, as it were.
Right. You don't have to, you don't get to, right? Sometimes you want to.
Oh,
sometimes
I see.
Right? I wouldn't want to say that any of these is like better than another, right? They do different things, right? So you don't want to show your reasoning. Sometimes you want to, but in this kind of format, you don't get to show your reasoning, even though it may make you come out really strong or impressive, or you could just say all the things you want to say, which is not the case in a very strict and sort of in a summary of law. You can't say all the things you want to say. Maybe the really impressive, interesting, novel ideas aren't expressed to the same extent, right? But there are other things you can do that in these more convoluted genres are going to be a lot harder.
So let me ask, this is actually something that just occurred to me. Was there significant resistance against the imposition of a legal code? Because as you say, what the legal code does is it sort of whips out the rug from underneath the writer, and therefore anyone who's following him cannot follow their logic. It just really has to take their word for it almost. Okay, this is forbidden, this is permitted, and doesn't really receive the arguments as to why. Was there, and again, this is not a completely new form of halakhic writing. After all, Maimonides did something similar, already in the end of the 12th century. But so if this is the genre that, so to speak, conquers the halakhic world, at least to a certain degree, were there those who were unhappy with this, so to speak, innovation?
There was definitely some resistance, especially in Ashkenaz, because the idea was that this is not the way we teach halakha, right? That this is not sort of the accepted way that we do things. Not only in terms of just, traditions and not wanting to change anything, right? But even in the sense of like, this is not how Jewish law works in our circles, right? That really the idea was that halakha is determined by a rabbi. And as the Rabbi Chaim of Friedberg, the brother of the Maharal of Prague, who maybe gives us the most explicit discussion in his opposition to Ramah's work, actually to Torat Chatat rather than Shulchan Aruch, but the arguments are pretty much, can be made about both. In his opposition, right, says that even a rabbi who gives you certain principles to use, for example, to be lenient in a case of, extreme urgency or need, well, maybe he meant it for his cases of extreme urgency. Like, who says you can export that and use that in a different case, right? So there was this opposition that comes even from the idea that that's just not how law works in our world, right? And I think one of the big changes that the Shulchan Aruch established is a distinction between minhag and halakha, between custom and law, that is much stricter of a distinction than perhaps the one you would see in Ashkenaz before, where custom and law were not very easily distinguishable. When there was a lot of minhag type material that was halakha, or even minhag type thinking that is applied when doing halakhic reasoning. That's something, we think of as sort of very different realms and that we're not as separate. So this opposition, in his terms is really, very deeply about what halakha is even supposed to be and how it's supposed to function. But I'm glad you brought up Maimonides, because of course there was also opposition to codification in his day.
Yes.
And I think that's where, the historical context matters a lot. A lot has been made of, one of the oppositions to Maimonides' code is that he does not bring the sources, so you can't go back and check. And when we say, well, Shulchan Aruch does something similar, right? They also don't bring back the sources. Well, yes, but minor difference, right? It's organized just like the Arba Turim in the same order. And you can go to Beit Yosef and you can go to Dalkei Moshe, to Rabbi Moshe. So this is, equivalent of Beit Yosef, or glosses on Beit Yosef. And there you have all the sources, right? Not just the sources of the Arba Turim and whatever the Arba Turim summarizes, but also the sources of everything that happened in between, right? And since it existed, it was organized in that way. So organization matters because it makes it easy to sort of cross-reference. but print also matters because it just made the work more accessible, and it was printed off and it was there, right? So to take away the sources in that kind of a work in that period is very different from taking away the sources, in a medieval work.
Because the blueprint's already
right.
there.
The blueprints, they're not only that, Ramah explicitly says, but if you don't understand something you're not sure, you can always check,
Right.
either my glasses or Beit Yosef, right? So this is the way research is, halakhic research is already being done, right? So the monopoly it looks different. It's you can't completely take over. These other works exist and they're there and they're almost made to be consulted together. Maybe not for every Jew who wants to know the halacha, but definitely for scholars and rabbis who want to delve deeper and disagree.
And none of them had the sort of imperious self-confidence of Maimonides, who really didn't appear to be all that interested as to the halakhic consensus or the halakhic opinions of others, in the sense that his code was supposed to be sort of laying a sort of tarmac over everything that had happened before and flattening the road for everyone.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just a question of self-confidence, right? It's also a question. I think that's exactly what he set out to do. He was, creating this, right? And I'm not necessarily sure that that's what a work like Shulchan Aruch set out to do.
Okay, one last topic that we can only delve into briefly, we're running out of time, which is that of Kabbalah. And what piqued my interest was something that we spoke about a little bit earlier, specifically about printing, was the sort of the idea of a text can run away from you if suddenly you can print thousands of copies and send them to the entire world, and then who knows what will happen. And that's one of the most interesting things about the early modern period from an intellectual perspective, seems to be this dissemination of Kabbalah, because it seems to be that until the expulsion of from Spain, let's say in 1492, it seems that Kabbalah spread relatively slowly and in a much more of a clandestine manner, and within very specific elite circles. But suddenly you have, and then in the 16th century, you have what is generally, the sort of golden age of Kabbalah in Tzfat. So you have people like Ramosha Cordovero and the Arizal, Yitzhak Luria, and Yosef Karo himself, and others who are producing these Kabbalistic texts. And they quite quickly go on to essentially conquer the Jewish world in a way. I mean, they spread everywhere. So, I mean, was it just printing? What was it? What happened? Why did Kabbalah suddenly shift from the preserve of a few elite scholars to having one on every shelf?
So it's definitely not just printing. You have a lot of, as we mentioned before, mobility, right? People moving around with their knowledge, right? So that's a big part of it as well. But it's definitely in many ways also printing. And here printing not just in a sense of this work being, reproduced and spread so many times over. It's also in a sense when the, one of, the most canonical works of Kabbalah, the Zohar, is not just being printed, but in a sense created, right? What you had before that is, as you described it, these very small, very elite circles of, Kabbalistic teachings. But also in terms of the text, you have a much more kind of spread out world of little pieces of Zoharic knowledge, right? And what you really get as a result of the printing of the Zohar, and I would argue maybe even the fact that, two printing houses in two Italian cities were printing the Zohar at the same time
Cremona and
in the
Mantua,
16th
right?
century.
Yeah.
Exactly. So what you get happening there is, and surprisingly, they don't, their editions are quite similar. I mean, not surprisingly, they explicitly in some places set out to do that. So you have one remark, I don't remember in which of the editions it is, where they mentioned that, right, because the other edition has this, even though we don't think this is, this part of the Zohar should be here, we don't think this is real Zohar material, because they put it in there, we're putting it in there too. Right, so you get this sort of even
looking
across
over your
editions.
Shoulder.
Right, but even, if we don't go to quite that level, right, just at the level of collecting all this material and making it part of one book, where, the assumption is that, all of this is the Zohar, this happens really as it comes off the printing press, right? Before, nobody had this kind of like the ultimate collection, right? You had these small groups, as you said, that transmitted this, and of course they could transmit it, and this is what you get with manuscript dissemination, right? Much more selectively, right? Even though you can copy things and you can copy them many times, you can spread them out, right? And you mentioned this before about the audience being anonymous, right? When you're doing manuscript copying, at least at one point, there is a sort of physically, you need two people to, somehow be connected over one actual material physical manuscript for it to be transmitted, right? One sort of link in the chain. In terms of print, it's something that can be created once and then spread out into all directions, and you don't know who that person is, right? And there's much, much less control over sort of where it ends up and who reads it, right? So in that sense, when you're talking about this sort of esoteric knowledge, right, it's a huge, huge change. So it's not just a change in terms of, right, you can just buy this in a store now, right? You don't need to know the person who knows the person, right? But there's also this change of like, now there is something called the Zohar that has all the text inside, right? And that is also a sea change when it comes to the world of Kabbalistic knowledge.
Can I ask, so those who are, but printers are also those who are commenting on it after in the 16th, 17th century. Do they have a kind of self-consciousness that they're doing something new, and they're sending off their books to print, and these books will print in their hundreds or their thousands, or be sent all over the Jewish world? I mean, do they see themselves as living in a slightly different age? I mean, this is a very general question.
There's definitely, yes. It's a good question, and it's definitely there. So in a lot of the, right, and that's, I mean, this goes back to what I said before about sort of historians noticing certain sources because like they give us text and then we have material to work with. Right. One of the sources that historians like to deal with are polemics, right, or these big disagreements about issues, and partially just because polemics are fun and interesting, but also because they generate discussions about topics. Right. So we never would have known how Ashkenazi halakha was transmitted, especially since, they didn't write so much. You don't get so many discussions describing, like, here's how we think about these things, unless there's a polemic, right? And when you have Rav Chaim Friedberg opposing what Rama is doing, then you suddenly get a description of, like, that's not how halakha should work. This is how halakha should work, right? And you get something similar here. So, would you otherwise have a Kabbalist saying like, this is new, this is different, and like sort of self-consciously reflecting these things, maybe not. But what you do get is when there's a lot of discussion about publishing halakhic writings and explaining halakhic writings and printing halakha, right? A lot around that discussion, both the pro and the contra sides, right? Both the sides saying halakha should not be disseminated, the side saying halakha should be printed, and the side saying that, really these things should ideally be secret, but now is a special time where it's necessary. All of those sides finally express themselves about the fact that this was done before, so that this wasn't done before. So certainly both pro, con, and the sort of, this is an exceptional state, they all are conscious of the fact that, printing Kabbalah is not an obvious thing at all. It's something that, either shouldn't be done or requires defending. And a lot of the defending also goes to the sort of unprecedented aspect of it. So they'll say, this is what's necessary to bring about, the final redemption. Or let's say that this is, we're in a state of emergency because of, the many expulsions and the dispersion of the Jewish people and so on. And this is necessary to sort of rescue us, right? So you have these kind of ideas that tie into this unprecedentedness, and it's explicitly, discussed in those terms.
So maybe that's a warning to us historians that we should engage not just in scholarship but also fiery polemics, so that our works will reflect what is going on in the world, will be read by future generations. I suppose I often end off these podcasts by asking sort of a lighter question to you, which is something along the lines of, you do a lot of work on these figures, and Yaakov Emden and the Raman and Rav Yazgar. If you could invite one of them to your home for dinner to ask some questions, who would you ideally sit down with?
I'd be terrified of Rav Yaakov Emden. Definitely not.
Good answer. Yes, I think
I'd be fascinated. I would definitely, want to invite him, but then maybe like hide under the table or something.
Fair enough.
In terms of, figures, they're all so fascinating to me. I have a lot of questions for Rama in terms of maybe not so much his halakhic writing specifically, but his worldview, because he deals so much with halakha, and because, beyond Torah Torah, we don't really have an idea of how, did he have a philosophy, how he viewed his philosophy. So I think that would be fascinating. And as a rabbi who was very aware of the technological changes happening in his time, both he and, in a sense, Rav Shlomo Luria, as I said, his sort of older both colleague and relative, who also writes very interesting things about the shift to print. Right? He talks about, this change that happens when so many books are created and how, people rely on different aspects. I'd love to ask them what they think about, the technological changes we are going through, right? Whether it be, artificial intelligence or digital change, and what they would think, for example, of, an AI POSIC. Right. And, if that's a feasible thing or a good thing, and like how they would, relate to that. So those are definitely questions I would like to ask them.
Okay. Wow. That's actually a really interesting answer. And if you ever get that opportunity in some way or another, then, please do let us know. What
I'm not a mystic, unfortunately. So I don't know what my chances are.
That's exactly what a mystic would say. Okay, fine. Fantastic. Professor Morsel-Eisenberg, we are very grateful that you joined us today on the podcast of Jewish Ideas. Thank you very much. And we look forward to opportunities for more conversations in the future.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
This has been the podcast of Jewish Ideas by Torah in Motion, produced by Alicia Kelman and myself, JJ Kimchi. Edited and mixed by Alicia Kelman. You can stay up to date by subscribing in your favorite podcast app. To support more thoughtful Jewish content like this, please visit torahinmotion.org/donate.